I stood in the venue coordinator's office with the invoice folder open on my desk at home, my phone hot against my ear, watching my son Marcus fumble with his tie through my laptop screen during our video call 3 days before his wedding. He just told me his fiancée Sienna had finalized the seating chart without consulting me, placing me at table 19 beside the kitchen service doors, while her twice-divorced Aunt Margot claimed the seat beside him at the head table. 27 years I'd raised him alone after his father walked out, worked doubles at the hospital to afford his engineering degree, and now I was being hidden like damaged furniture. My hand trembled as I refreshed my bank account, showing the $47,000 balance I'd saved for this wedding, every dollar earmarked in a spreadsheet I'd maintained for 3 years. If you're watching this from your own kitchen table wondering if you'd have done the same, drop your state below and hit subscribe, because this decision changed everything. The venue contract sat in my lap, with my signature still wet on the final payment authorization I hadn't yet submitted. Something cold settled in my chest. Marcus cleared his throat on the video call, his eyes sliding away from the camera toward something off-screen, and I heard Sienna's voice sharp and clipped in his background, telling him to wrap it up because the florist was waiting. He'd always been soft-spoken, thoughtful, the kind of boy who brought me dandelions from the yard and called them sunshine flowers when he was 5. Now at 29, he was still that gentle soul, but something had changed in the 8 months since the engagement, like watching a puppet discover its strings for the first time. I asked him directly if he'd seen the seating chart himself, or if Sienna had simply informed him of the arrangements after the fact. His pause told me everything before his words confirmed it. She'd sent him a photo of the finalized layout that morning, with a text saying it was handled. No discussion needed. The head table would seat 8 people, including both her parents, her sister, her maid of honor, and somehow her Aunt Margot, who'd flown in from Arizona specifically because Sienna claimed they were exceptionally close despite Marcus meeting her exactly once at Thanksgiving. I pulled up the contract on my second monitor, scrolling to clause 7.3 regarding payment schedules and cancellation terms. My nursing training kicking in with that same clinical detachment I used when delivering bad news to families in the ICU. The venue required 70% upfront, which I'd paid 4 months ago, with the remaining 30% due 72 hours before the event, along with final guest count confirmation and any service upgrades. That final payment sat in my account right now, $1,100 waiting to transfer. And according to the cancellation policy I'd studied when we first booked, any cancellation made more than 60 hours before the event would forfeit only the initial deposit of $5,000 while refunding the remainder. I glanced at my watch, showing 41 seconds past 2 in the afternoon on Tuesday. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday at 6, which gave me exactly 96 hours. My cursor hovered over the payment portal. Marcus was still talking on the video call, explaining that Sienna had very specific vision for the photography composition and didn't want the family portraits to look crowded or unbalanced. Unbalanced meant me, apparently, the woman who'd arranged her entire existence around raising him after Tom left us for his dental hygienist when Marcus was 2 years old. I'd skipped vacations, driven a 15-year-old sedan, held together with hope and regular oil changes, worked every holiday the hospital would assign me at time-and-a-half pay, all so Marcus could have violin lessons and math tutoring, and eventually a college education without crushing debt. The photo albums in my hallway closet chronicled every gap-toothed smile, every science fair trophy, every graduation milestone, just the two of us building a life from the wreckage Tom had left behind. Now Sienna wanted those family portraits to exclude the actual family. I asked Marcus what he thought about the seating arrangement, really thought about it, and he did that thing he'd done since childhood when caught between competing loyalties, rubbing his left eyebrow with his thumb while his gaze went distant. He said Sienna had worked very hard on creating an elegant atmosphere, and maybe I could understand it was her special day. Her special day funded entirely by my special sacrifice. But I didn't say that part out loud because I'd raised him to be better than the bitter divorced people who turned their children into emotional battlegrounds. Instead, I asked him if he remembered the conversation we'd had when he first got engaged, sitting in my kitchen over the coffee cake I'd baked, when I'd offered to contribute significantly to the wedding with just one request, which was that we make decisions together as a family. He'd promised then, holding both my hands across the table, that I'd be involved in every major choice, because none of this would be possible without me. That promise had lasted approximately 6 weeks before Sienna started presenting completed plans rather than options for discussion. The floral arrangements, the menu selections, the band choice, even the invitation wording had all arrived as finished products with my input reduced to nodding approval. Now the seating chart represented the final insult. Table 19. I'd looked up the venue layout online, and table 19 was literally positioned behind a decorative column that would block my view of the ceremony. I minimized the video call window and opened my email to the venue coordinator, a cheerful woman named Denise, who'd given us the tour back in January and had been copied on every subsequent planning email. My fingers found the keyboard with 30 years of medical charting muscle memory behind them, typing a message with the subject line reading simply, "Payment and Arrangements Query." I explained that I was the mother of the groom and primary financial sponsor of the event, and I needed to schedule an urgent call to discuss some concerns about the final arrangements before submitting the remaining balance. Professional, neutral, giving nothing away yet. Denise responded within 6 minutes, her reply appearing with a cheerful chime, saying she had availability at 4 that afternoon for a phone conference, or could meet in person at the venue if I preferred face-to-face discussion. I booked the in-person meeting, calculated I could make the 40-minute drive and still be back before my evening shift started at 7, and told Marcus I needed to go handle something work-related. His relief at ending the uncomfortable conversation was visible even through the laptop camera's mediocre resolution. The drive to Willowbrook Estate took me through the kind of suburban sprawl that had replaced actual farmland over the past decade. Subdivision after subdivision of identical beige houses with names like Harmony Hills and Serenity Meadows. Developments that promised community but delivered isolation in neatly landscaped packages. The venue itself occupied 10 acres of what used to be a horse farm, the original barn converted into a reception hall with exposed beams and Edison bulbs, the kind of rustic chic aesthetic that currently dominated wedding Pinterest boards and cost an absolute fortune to rent. I'd toured it with Marcus and Sienna back when we were supposedly making joint decisions, and I'd agreed it was beautiful despite my internal calculation that the rental fee alone could have funded a down payment on a starter home. But Sienna had declared it perfect, and Marcus had looked at her with such hopeful adoration that I'd signed the initial contract without protest. Now I pulled into the gravel parking lot, wondering if that had been my first mistake in a series of capitulations. Denise met me at the main entrance, wearing the same professional smile she'd deployed during our initial tour, all warmth and efficiency packaged in a navy pantsuit and sensible heels. She ushered me into her office, a converted tack room that still smelled faintly of leather and hay beneath the newer scents of lavender room spray and coffee. Wedding binders lined the shelves, each couple's vision documented and organized with color-coded tabs. She pulled Marcus and Sienna's binder, thick with fabric swatches and menu printouts, and asked how she could help me today. I slid the seating chart across her desk, the one Sienna had apparently finalized that morning, with my placement at table 19 circled in pen. Denise's professional smile flickered just for a second before reassembling itself. She said the bride typically had final approval on seating arrangements and guest experience design. I asked her to pull up the payment records, showing exactly whose name appeared on the contracts and whose bank account had funded this entire event. She typed something into her computer, her manicured nails clicking against the keys with a rhythm that matched my elevated heart rate, and then she went very still, staring at her monitor. The primary contract holder and financial guarantor was listed as myself, Eleanor Walsh, with Marcus and Sienna listed as secondary parties and event participants. Every payment had originated from my account, every communication regarding charges had been addressed to me, and technically, according to the contract structure, final approval authority rested with the person assuming financial responsibility unless explicitly delegated in writing. I asked Denise if Sienna had submitted any formal documentation transferring decision-making authority, any addendum to the original contract reassigning control. Denise scrolled through her files, her professional composure developing small cracks around the edges, and admitted that no such paperwork existed in their records. The seating chart had been submitted via email that morning with a note saying it was the final version, but there'd been no authorization audit because, generally speaking, the venue assumed family members communicated amongst themselves about such arrangements. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, navigating to the scheduled payment screen where the $14th and $100 final installment sat ready for my authorization. The transfer was scheduled for automatic processing at midnight Thursday, giving the venue their required 72-hour advance notice. I asked Denise what would happen if that payment didn't go through, if I declined to authorize the final installment. She leaned back in her chair with an expression that suggested this conversation had just entered territory beyond her typical wedding coordination duties, possibly into waters requiring management consultation or legal review. After a moment, she pulled out a different folder, the one containing contractual terms and conditions, rather than floral arrangements and menu selections. She explained that failure to submit final payment by the 72-hour deadline would trigger the cancellation clause. The event would be canceled. The initial deposit would be forfeited, but any payments beyond the deposit would be refunded within 14 business days. The venue would then be free to book the date for another client or leave it vacant at their discretion. I sat with that information, feeling it settle into my bones the way diagnoses used to settle when I was still doing bedside care. That moment when all the symptoms aligned into a clear picture that demanded decisive action. Denise was watching me carefully now, her vendor-client cheerfulness replaced by something more guarded, perhaps recognizing that she'd stumbled into a family conflict with financial implications beyond her typical scope. I asked her what options existed for modifying event arrangements within the 72-hour window, specifically regarding seating charts and family positioning. She said that technically, modifications could be submitted up until 48 hours before the event. But typically, the bride and groom preferred to finalize details earlier to avoid last-minute stress. I clarified my question, asking specifically whether I, as the primary contract holder and financial guarantor, could submit seating modifications. Her pause was answer enough, but eventually she confirmed that, yes, contract holder approval would supersede secondary party preferences in cases of disputed arrangements, though she strongly encouraged family discussion to resolve conflicts rather than venue-mediated intervention. I thanked her for her time and honesty, told her I'd be in touch before the payment deadline, and drove home through traffic that felt surreal in its mundane normalcy. Commuters heading to evening activities completely unaware that I was considering detonating my only child's wedding 3 days before the ceremony. My phone buzzed repeatedly during the drive, Marcus calling 4 times and Sienna twice. But I let them roll to voicemail because I needed space to think without Marcus's wounded confusion or Sienna's indignant outrage filling my ears. At home, I made tea, I didn't drink, stared at the photos covering my refrigerator, documenting Marcus's entire childhood, and wondered when exactly I'd taught him that my love could be taken for granted. The answer arrived with uncomfortable clarity around photo number 17, Marcus at age 8 holding his science fair ribbon, where I'd worked a double shift to afford the materials for his volcanic eruption project and then missed the actual presentation because the hospital called me in for emergency coverage. I'd taught him through 1,000 small sacrifices that my needs came last. My nursing shift that evening passed in a blur of vital signs and medication rounds, my body executing trained routines while my mind circled the decision like a surgical team around a complicated case. The other nurses noticed my distraction, and during our midnight break, my friend Rita asked if everything was okay with the wedding plans. I gave her the abbreviated version, watching her face transform from sympathetic interest to shocked disbelief as I described the seating arrangement and my subsequent venue visit. Rita had known me for 12 years, had covered my shifts when Marcus graduated college, had listened to countless stories about his achievements and my pride in his character. Now she set down her coffee and said something that landed like a surgical strike to my reasoning defenses. She said that if I paid for this wedding as planned, I'd be teaching Marcus that disrespect had no consequences. And worse, I'd be teaching his future children that grandmothers existed to be used and then hidden away when convenient. The generational implications hit me harder than the personal insult had. Thursday morning arrived with gray skies promising rain, and my phone showing 17 missed calls, 12 from Marcus, and 5 from Sienna, plus a text thread that had grown increasingly frantic in tone as I'd maintained radio silence. Marcus's messages progressed from confused concern through defensive justification and landed finally at panicked pleading, begging me to call him back, promising we could work everything out, insisting that Sienna hadn't meant any offense by the seating arrangements. Sienna's messages had no such evolution, remaining consistent in their imperious assumption that I was being unreasonably difficult about minor logistical details that had no bearing on the actual meaning of the celebration. She'd even sent a message at 2 a.m. suggesting that perhaps I was experiencing some kind of emotional breakdown related to my age and empty nest syndrome, and maybe I should consider therapy to process my feelings about Marcus moving on with his life. I read that message 3 times, each reading adding another layer of ice to the cold resolve forming in my chest. I called Denise at 9 when the venue office opened, my voice steady with the same calm I'd used when explaining terminal diagnoses to families who didn't want to accept reality. I informed her that after careful consideration, I'd decided not to authorize the final payment, that I was formally withdrawing my financial support for the event, and that she should proceed with cancellation protocols as outlined in the contract. There was a long silence before she asked if I was absolutely certain, if there was any possibility of family mediation or modified arrangements that might resolve the situation. I told her I appreciated her concern, but my decision was final, and I'd like written confirmation of the cancellation and refund timeline sent to my email within the business day. She said she'd need to consult with her manager before processing a cancellation this close to the event date, and could I please wait for a call back within the hour? I agreed, and ended the call, then immediately blocked both Marcus's and Sienna's numbers because I needed space to see this through without being swayed by emotional manipulation. The venue manager called me himself 45 minutes later, a man named Gerald, who spoke with the careful diplomatic tone of someone accustomed to handling difficult clients and impossible demands. He introduced himself, confirmed my identity and relationship to the contract, and asked if we could discuss the situation before taking any irrevocable actions. I appreciated his professionalism while remaining firm in my position, explaining that this wasn't an impulsive decision, but rather a necessary boundary after months of being systematically excluded from planning decisions despite providing complete financial backing. Gerald listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked a question that surprised me with its directness. He asked whether my goal was to cancel the wedding entirely or to leverage the cancellation threat into gaining appropriate respect and inclusion in the arrangements. His insight was uncomfortably accurate. I admitted I didn't want to ruin Marcus's wedding. I wanted him to understand that financial contribution didn't equate to blank check permission for disrespect. Gerald proposed an alternative. He suggested that instead of processing an immediate cancellation, he could place a formal hold on the event pending contract holder approval of all final arrangements, effectively freezing everything until I either authorized the payment or confirmed cancellation. This would give Marcus and Sienna approximately 36 hours to address my concerns and submit modified plans for my approval, while also making crystal clear that my approval was not optional given my role as financial guarantor. The hold would be documented in writing, sent to all parties, and would make explicit that no event services would be rendered without my written authorization and payment. If they failed to reach acceptable terms within the 36-hour window, the cancellation would process automatically, and they'd need to either fund the wedding themselves or postpone to a future date. It was a solution that maintained my leverage while giving Marcus one chance to choose respect over entitlement. I authorized Gerald to implement the hold immediately, feeling something that might have been relief or might have been dread settle into my stomach like lead weight. The email arrived in Marcus's inbox at 11:17 Thursday morning, copied to Sienna and myself, with the subject line, "Event hold, action required." Gerald had drafted it with precise legal language that left no room for misinterpretation, explaining that due to concerns raised by the primary contract holder and financial guarantor Eleanor Walsh, the Willowbrook estate was placing an immediate hold on all services related to the Marcus Walsh and Sienna Hartley wedding scheduled for Saturday, June 15th. The hold would remain in effect until either Mrs. Eleanor Walsh provided written approval of all event arrangements and authorized final payment, or the 72-hour payment deadline passed without authorization, triggering automatic cancellation per contract terms. All vendors, including catering, floristry, photography, and entertainment, had been notified of the hold and instructed to await further communication before proceeding with scheduled services. The email concluded by encouraging all parties to communicate openly and reach mutually acceptable arrangements, with a direct phone line to Gerald for any questions or concerns. I imagined Marcus reading that email, his face going pale, and felt absolutely nothing resembling guilt. My phone started ringing from unknown numbers within minutes, Marcus presumably using friends' phones or office lines to circumvent my block, but I let them all go to voicemail while I prepared for my shift at the hospital. The messages piled up, Marcus's voice raw with panic and confusion, demanding to know what I'd done and why and how we could fix it. Sienna's voice appeared on several messages too, her earlier imperious tone replaced by something that might have been strategic sweetness or might have been genuine distress, difficult to distinguish. She left a message around noon saying she was sorry if there'd been any misunderstanding about the seating chart, that she'd never intended to make me feel excluded, that maybe we could talk about adjustments if I'd just call her back. The apology was so carefully worded, so precisely avoiding actual accountability while maintaining plausible contrition, that I recognized it as the kind of corporate non-apology I'd heard from hospital administrators explaining away budget cuts while calling them operational optimizations. I saved all the messages and continued getting ready for work. Rita met me in the hospital parking lot during shift change, having somehow sensed I might need moral support during what was rapidly becoming the most controversial decision of my life. She didn't ask if I was sure or try to talk me down from the ledge, just walked beside me through the automatic doors while I explained what I'd done and how the next 36 hours would determine whether Marcus's wedding happened or imploded into family legend as the event his mother torpedoed. Rita asked what I wanted the outcome to be, really wanted beneath all the hurt and anger. I realized I wanted Marcus to show up at my door, alone, without Sienna coaching him through a diplomatic script, and acknowledge that I deserved better treatment than I'd received. I wanted him to recognize that being a good son wasn't about smooth wedding logistics, but about honoring the person who'd built her entire adult life around his well-being. Rita nodded and said that was a reasonable thing to want, and also one of the hardest things to teach grown children who'd never learned to see their parents as fully human. My shift proceeded through its usual rhythms of crisis and routine, checking monitors and updating charts. But around 8 that evening, something unexpected happened that would shift the entire trajectory of what I'd started. A patient's daughter, waiting in the ICU family room while her mother underwent emergency surgery, struck up conversation during my break. Her name was Lauren, early 30s, and she'd recently canceled her own wedding after her fiancé refused to include her father in any meaningful capacity because he was in a wheelchair, and the bride's perfect aesthetic vision didn't include visible disability at the ceremony. Lauren had called off a $30,000 event 3 weeks before the date, endured months of social backlash and lost deposits, and said it was the best decision she'd ever made because it revealed who her fiancé really was beneath the charming surface. She'd found out 6 months later that he'd started dating someone new and was already engaged again, this time with a bride who apparently shared his views about keeping imperfect family members out of the spotlight. Lauren looked me in the eye. She said that if I went through with letting this wedding proceed under Sienna's terms, I'd be setting a precedent for every future family gathering, every holiday, every grandchild's birthday party. The message I'd send was that financial leverage could compel my attendance but not my respect, that I'd accept whatever scraps of inclusion were tossed my way as long as Marcus smiled and promised he still loved me. Lauren had seen her father accept that treatment for years from her mother's side of the family, always positioned at the edges of photos and celebrations, always accommodated but never truly welcomed, and it had killed something essential in him long before the stroke that landed him in our ICU tonight. She said that self-respect wasn't selfish, it was necessary, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was refuse to enable their worst behavior. I sat with her until her mother's surgery ended, and when I left the hospital that night, I knew with absolute certainty I wouldn't be backing down from the hold I'd placed. Marcus would rise to meet my expectations or face the consequences. Friday morning broke clear and bright, mockingly perfect weather for a wedding that remained frozen in administrative purgatory, waiting for an authorization I hadn't yet decided to grant. My phone had acquired several new voicemails overnight, including one from my sister Patricia, whom I hadn't heard from in 3 months, clearly recruited by Marcus to talk sense into me. Patricia's message employed our shared family history as leverage, reminding me of our mother's death when I was 22 and how much I'd wished she could have attended my wedding to Tom, suggesting I shouldn't squander the blessing of being present for Marcus's milestone. It was emotional blackmail wrapped in sisterly concern, and it might have worked if Patricia hadn't conveniently forgotten that she'd sided with Tom during the divorce, maintaining contact with him and his dental hygienist girlfriend while I'd rebuilt my life from scratch. I deleted her message without responding, made coffee, and opened my laptop to check email, finding something that made my hand freeze on the mouse. An email from Sienna directly, time-stamped 4:37 that morning. The email was long, much longer than Sienna's usual terse communications, and it represented either genuine reflection or extremely calculated manipulation, depending on how charitably I chose to interpret it. She wrote that she'd spent the entire night unable to sleep, thinking about the seating chart and my reaction and the choices that had led to this crisis. She admitted that wedding planning had consumed her over the past months, that she'd become fixated on creating a perfect event that would photograph beautifully and impress their friends. And somewhere in that fixation, she'd stopped thinking about people and started thinking about optics. She wrote that her own parents had divorced when she was young, that she'd grown up being shuffled between households where she often felt like an inconvenient accessory to her parents' new lives, and maybe she'd developed some unhealthy perspectives about family relationships and obligations. The seating chart hadn't been intended to hurt me, but rather to maintain clean sightlines for the photographer, though she recognized how that must have felt given my financial investment and emotional support. She asked if we could meet for coffee that morning. I reread the email 3 times, analyzing its language the way I'd analyze lab results looking for hidden indicators, trying to determine if this represented authentic growth or strategic retreat. The details about her childhood felt too specific to be fabricated purely for manipulation purposes, but the timing was also suspiciously perfect, arriving just as the 36-hour deadline ticked closer, and the reality of cancellation became concrete. My skepticism warred with a faint hope that maybe Sienna was capable of genuine reflection, that maybe this entire crisis could become a turning point toward healthier family dynamics rather than permanent fractured relationships. I responded with a single line agreeing to meet at 10 at the coffee shop near my house, neutral territory where we could talk without Marcus hovering anxiously in the background. Then I showered, dressed in the kind of casual armor I wore for difficult family meetings, and drove to meet my son's fiancée for what might determine whether their wedding happened tomorrow or became a cautionary tale about entitlement and consequences. Sienna arrived exactly on time, looking authentically exhausted, her usual polished presentation replaced by minimal makeup and hair pulled into a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater rather than her typical carefully curated outfits. She ordered plain coffee instead of her usual elaborate vanilla oat milk extra foam creation, and we sat at a corner table where the morning light was harsh enough to show the shadows under both our eyes. She started talking before I could, words spilling out with an urgency that suggested she'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times and was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she didn't begin immediately. She said that Marcus had been devastated by my actions, that he'd cried for the first time since his father left when he'd read the venue's email, and seeing him that broken had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own behavior. She admitted she'd been controlling about the wedding planning, shutting me out of decisions while still expecting my financial support, treating me like a sponsor rather than family. She said her mother had modeled that kind of transactional relationship approach, maintaining connection with people only as long as they provided useful resources or social benefit, and Sienna had absorbed those patterns without examining them critically until now. Watching Marcus's devastation had made her realize she was on track to build the same kind of hollow family structure she'd grown up in, where everyone performed roles, but nobody actually connected with authentic vulnerability. She pulled out her phone and showed me a new seating chart where I was positioned at the head table beside Marcus, with her Aunt Margot moved to table 7 with other extended family. She'd also drafted a modified schedule that included time for extended family photos before the ceremony, a mother-son dance during the reception, and a formal thank you speech acknowledging my contributions. She said these changes were non-negotiable, regardless of whether I authorized the payment, that she'd already sent the updated arrangements to the venue and vendors, and that she was asking not for my money, but for my forgiveness and a chance to build an actual relationship. I looked at the seating chart on her phone, at my name in the spot that should have been obvious from the beginning, and felt something crack in the defensive shell I'd constructed around my anger. This was what I'd wanted, not just the acknowledgement, but the genuine understanding behind it, the recognition that respect couldn't be segregated from relationship. Yet I also knew that crisis-driven revelations didn't always translate into lasting behavior change, that Sienna might mean every word in this moment and still revert to old patterns once the immediate threat passed and the wedding was safely behind us. I asked her directly what would happen a year from now when Marcus and I had a disagreement about something, whether she'd support him maintaining boundaries with me or encourage him to dismiss my concerns as unreasonable maternal interference. Her answer would determine whether I believed this transformation was genuine or temporary theater designed to secure my authorization and financial backing for tomorrow's event. She met my eyes without hesitation and said something I hadn't expected. She said that 1 year from now, if we had disagreements, she hoped we'd have built enough trust that we could address them directly rather than through Marcus as an intermediary, that we could disagree respectfully without anyone being exiled to metaphorical table 19. She acknowledged that she might still mess up, that undoing 29 years of learned behavior wouldn't happen overnight, and she was asking me to hold her accountable when she slipped into old patterns rather than simply withdrawing or deploying financial consequences. She said she wanted me to be an actual grandmother to their future children, not a checkbook they visited on holidays, and that required her doing the uncomfortable work of examining her own attitudes about family and obligation. She pulled out a second document from her bag, a handwritten letter she'd drafted that morning, addressed to me and signed by both her and Marcus, formally apologizing for the disrespect I'd endured during the planning process and committing to specific change behaviors going forward. The letter included concrete promises about monthly family dinners, advance consultation on major decisions, and mutual respect as a foundational principle. I read the letter twice while my coffee went cold, Sienna sitting silent across from me with an expression that wavered between hope and resignation. The document was thorough enough to indicate significant thought and specific enough to provide actual accountability measures rather than vague intentions. It acknowledged particular instances where I'd been excluded or dismissed, named them explicitly without euphemism or minimization, and outlined corrective approaches for future similar situations. Most significantly, it included a clause stating that if either Marcus or Sienna violated these commitments, I was empowered to address it directly without being labeled dramatic or unreasonable, and they would respond with genuine engagement rather than defensive dismissiveness. It was, in essence, a relationship contract that took my concerns seriously while providing framework for building something healthier going forward. I folded the letter carefully and asked Sienna whether Marcus had contributed equally to drafting this or whether she'd written it and convinced him to sign it. Her response told me everything. She said Marcus had written the first draft last night after I'd blocked his calls, sitting on their apartment floor surrounded by wedding planning binders, while she'd sat beside him reading every email and document from the past 8 months. Seeing clearly for the first time how comprehensively they'd excluded me while demanding my financial support. Marcus had written the letter through tears, Sienna said, wrestling with the realization that he'd replicated his father's pattern of taking me for granted and then acting wounded when I finally enforced boundaries. She'd added the specific behavioral commitments and accountability structures because her psychology background taught her that intentions without implementation plans rarely survived contact with old habits and comfortable patterns. They'd both signed it at 3 a.m, exhausted and terrified, and finally understanding that the wedding was the least important thing at stake here compared to the foundational relationship patterns they were either establishing or destroying. Sienna pushed the letter across the table toward me and said that whether or not I authorized the payment, they wanted me to keep this document as their promise that things would be different going forward. I sat in the coffee shop with the letter in my hands, the morning light shifting across the table as other customers came and went around us. Ordinary people navigating ordinary Fridays without any idea that someone nearby was deciding whether to detonate or diffuse a family crisis. My phone buzzed with a text from Gerald at the venue, reminding me that the authorization deadline was now 12 hours away, that if I intended to proceed with the wedding, I needed to provide written approval and payment authorization by 10 that evening. Sienna saw me glance at my phone and said that regardless of my decision, she and Marcus would understand, that they'd created this situation through carelessness and entitlement, and they'd accept whatever consequences followed. She said they'd already discussed postponing the wedding if necessary, using the time to rebuild trust and demonstrate through consistent behavior that their promises were genuine rather than crisis-motivated theater. That offer, more than anything else, convinced me she might actually mean what she was saying because it cost her the thing she'd been most fixated on achieving, the perfect event. I told Sienna I needed time to think, that I'd give her my answer by 8 that evening, leaving 2 hours for venue notification regardless of which direction I chose. She nodded without protest, gathered her things, and hugged me before leaving with an embrace that felt different from the perfunctory squeezes we'd exchanged at previous family gatherings, this one containing actual vulnerability and gratitude. After she left, I sat alone with my cold coffee and the handwritten letter, reading it a third time and then a fourth, looking for hidden escape clauses or strategic ambiguity, but finding only what appeared to be genuine accountability and commitment to change. My phone showed multiple text messages from Rita checking in, asking if I needed moral support or distraction or someone to help me process the impossible position I'd created by taking a stand. I texted back asking if she could meet me after her shift ended at 6, needing to talk through the decision with someone who'd witnessed my journey to this point and would tell me the truth rather than what I wanted to hear. She confirmed immediately, suggesting we meet at the park near both our houses, neutral ground where we could walk and talk. The afternoon passed in a strange, suspended state where I existed in multiple possible futures simultaneously, each one branching from the decision I'd make in a few hours. In one future, I authorized the payment. Marcus's wedding proceeded tomorrow, with me seated appropriately and acknowledged respectfully. And we began the careful work of building healthier patterns while hoping Sienna's crisis revelation translated into lasting change. In another future, I maintained the hold. The wedding was canceled, and we faced months or years of fractured relationship while Marcus and Sienna either learned the lessons I was trying to teach or simply resented me for ruining their event. A third future existed where I authorized the wedding, but remained cautiously distant, protecting myself from future hurt by never again investing so thoroughly in their lives, a defensive retreat that would feel safe but ultimately hollow. I couldn't yet tell which future represented wisdom and which represented cowardice, whether standing firm meant maintaining the cancellation or recognizing genuine contrition when it appeared. Rita met me at the park as promised, and we walked the familiar loop trail while I described the morning's coffee shop meeting and the letter currently folded in my jacket pocket. Rita listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful, and when I finished, she asked the question that cut through all my circular reasoning straight to the heart of what actually mattered. She asked whether I believed Marcus and Sienna were capable of genuine change, not whether they'd promised change or seemed sincere about change, but whether the actual human people they were today possessed the capacity for sustained behavioral modification. It was a clinical question, the kind we asked in nursing about patients' prognosis and treatment compliance, stripping away hope and fear to assess realistic likelihood based on observed patterns. I thought about Marcus, My gentle son, who'd brought me dandelions and called them sunshine flowers, who'd internalized my sacrifices so thoroughly he'd stopped seeing them as choices and started experiencing them as ambient conditions of his reality. I thought about Sienna's controlled presentation and her childhood of being shuffled between households. I told Rita I thought they were capable of change if they did the actual work rather than just feeling bad about their behavior and hoping that constituted growth. Marcus had always been capable of genuine reflection when pushed past his initial defensiveness, and Sienna had demonstrated enough insight in our conversation to suggest she understood the difference between performing contrition and examining root causes. But capability didn't guarantee follow-through, and my decision couldn't be based on optimistic projections about their future behavior, but rather on what I could accept if they reverted to old patterns 6 months from now. Rita asked what I could accept, really accept, without resentment poisoning everything. I realized I could accept having tried to teach better patterns, having drawn a clear boundary and maintained it long enough to prove I was serious, even if they ultimately failed to sustain the changes they'd promised. What I couldn't accept was never having tried, never having demanded respect, enabling their entitlement through continued unconditional financial support, while teaching Marcus that love meant enduring disrespect quietly. That distinction clarified everything. I called Gerald at 7:30, 90 minutes before the deadline, and authorized both the payment and the event to proceed under the modified arrangement Sienna had submitted that morning. Gerald confirmed receipt of my authorization, processed the payment immediately, and sent a formal email to all parties confirming that the hold was lifted and all vendor services were reauthorized for Saturday's ceremony and reception. He thanked me for working through the challenging situation and said he hoped the event would exceed our expectations. His professional neutrality maintained even though he'd witnessed more family drama in the past 48 hours than most venue coordinators encountered in entire seasons. I thanked him for his patience and diplomatic intervention, recognizing that his structured hold approach had created the pressure necessary for genuine conversation while providing framework for resolution. After ending the call, I texted Marcus directly, unblocking his number for the first time since Thursday morning. With a simple message stating that I'd authorized the wedding to proceed, I expected him to honor the commitments outlined in the letter Sienna had shown me, and I loved him regardless of the chaos we'd navigated together. His response arrived within seconds, a paragraph of gratitude and relief, and promises that dissolved into incomprehensible emotion toward the end. I smiled despite myself, recognizing my son in those typed tears. Friday evening dissolved into a flurry of last-minute preparations as vendors who'd been on hold for 36 hours scrambled to confirm details and finalize arrangements with compressed timelines. The florist called my cell phone directly around 8:45, having been given my number by the venue as the primary decision-maker, asking whether I'd prefer garden roses or peonies in the family table centerpieces since the original order had been partially reallocated during the hold period. I chose peonies, Marcus's favorite since childhood when he'd declared them fancy pom-poms, and felt something warm displace some of the lingering anger in my chest. The photographer emailed a revised shot list that included extended family portraits and a specific mother-son photo series she wanted to capture during the golden hour before the ceremony, having apparently received the updated schedule from Sienna along with notes about my importance to the event. Each vendor contact reinforced that something fundamental had shifted in how I was being positioned within the wedding narrative. No longer hidden funding source, but acknowledged family. It felt simultaneously vindicating and exhausting. Saturday morning arrived with that peculiar crystalline quality that makes photographers wealthy and brides superstitious, perfect blue skies and temperature in the sweet spot between comfortable and photogenic. I spent the morning at the salon with Sienna's bridal party, an inclusion that had been added to the schedule sometime Friday evening, getting my hair styled and makeup applied alongside the bridesmaids who treated me with careful friendliness that suggested Sienna had briefed them on recent events. The maid of honor, Sienna's sister Claire, actually apologized to me directly while we sat under adjacent dryers, saying she'd thought the original seating chart was weird, but hadn't questioned it because Sienna usually had specific reasons for her choices. Claire said she'd learned in the past 2 days that sometimes those specific reasons were based on flawed assumptions that needed challenging rather than automatic support. We bonded awkwardly over that recognition, two women on opposite sides of the bride trying to navigate newly redrawn boundaries. By noon, I looked objectively elegant in a navy dress I'd purchased months ago, appropriate for a mother of the groom, ready to participate in rather than observe my son's wedding. The venue was transformed when I arrived at 3 for pre-ceremony photos, the rustic barn space decorated with white fabric and greenery that softened the exposed beams into something ethereal rather than agricultural. Our family table, the head table where I would sit beside Marcus, was positioned centrally with clear sight lines to every corner of the reception space, impossible to overlook or ignore. My place setting included a small card with my name in calligraphy and a handwritten note from Marcus tucked underneath that I discovered when adjusting my napkin. The note was brief, just 3 sentences acknowledging that he'd failed me repeatedly during the planning process, that he was grateful I'd loved him enough to enforce boundaries even when it was hard, and that he hoped to spend the rest of his life proving he'd learned something essential from my willingness to let the wedding collapse rather than accept disrespect. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my purse, feeling tears threaten my carefully applied makeup, blinking them back through sheer determination. The photographer appeared and began orchestrating family groupings with cheerful efficiency. The photo session lasted 90 minutes and included every configuration the photographer could imagine. Marcus and me alone, both sets of parents together, extended family clusters, silly poses, and formal portraits. Marcus kept his arm around my shoulders through most of it, a physical declaration of connection that felt intentional rather than automatic, his way of making visible the relationship that Sienna had initially tried to minimize. Sienna herself moved through the photos with grace, positioning herself beside me in several shots and suggesting combinations that highlighted rather than hid my presence. At one point, while adjusting her veil between setups, she caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you," with an expression that contained genuine relief and gratitude. I nodded acknowledgement, still withholding complete trust, but recognizing effort when I saw it deployed consistently. The photographer captured that moment, the small exchange between bride and groom's mother, and later told me it was her favorite shot of the entire day because it contained actual emotion rather than performed happiness. She was right. The ceremony itself was beautiful, in the way weddings are when everyone involved has survived a crisis and emerged tentatively intact on the other side. Every moment loaded with subtext and earned meaning rather than empty tradition. I sat in the front row on Marcus's side, the position reserved for immediate family, and watched my son marry Sienna while mentally cataloging every choice that reflected the changes we'd negotiated. The officiant's remarks included specific acknowledgement of the parents who'd supported Marcus and Sienna's journey to this moment, naming me directly and recognizing my role in shaping the man standing at the altar. Marcus's vows included a promise to honor the people who'd loved him into existence, a line I recognized as aimed partly at me, his way of publicly committing to better behavior. When he looked at me during that line, his eyes held the same vulnerable trust I remembered from his childhood before divorce and hardship had taught him to take my presence for granted. I smiled through tears I no longer tried to hide. The reception unfolded with the kind of joyful chaos that characterizes successful celebrations, toasts and dancing, and food consumed in happy distraction from everyday concerns. My position at the head table meant I was visible in every candid shot, included in every group conversation, impossible to overlook or minimize. Sienna's Aunt Margot, displaced from her original seat of honor, spent part of the evening at table 7 looking vaguely confused about the arrangements, but too polite to make an issue of it publicly. I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered that her inclusion had been part of Sienna's original plan to populate the head table with people who photographed well rather than people who'd actually invested in Marcus's life. The DJ announced the mother-son dance, a tradition that hadn't appeared in any of the earlier planning documents but had been added to the timeline sometime Friday evening. Marcus extended his hand with a shy smile that took me back to his middle school dance class when he'd practiced leading on me in our living room, counting steps under his breath. We danced to In My Life by the Beatles, a song I'd played constantly during Marcus's childhood whenever I needed reminding that the hard days were building toward something meaningful, that sacrifice was accumulating into a life worth the cost. Marcus held my hand properly, maintaining the frame I'd taught him all those years ago, and halfway through the song, he leaned close and whispered that he was sorry for becoming the kind of man who needed his mother to threaten canceling his wedding, before he remembered to treat her with basic respect. He said watching the possibility of losing everything over the past 2 days had clarified what actually mattered, that fancy venues and perfect photography meant nothing compared to having me present and genuinely included. I told him I'd always be present when he wanted me there, but I wouldn't accept being hidden or diminished, that enforcing that boundary was an act of love for both of us. He nodded against my shoulder, and we finished the dance while guests watched with the kind of emotional investment that suggested gossip about recent drama had circulated through the social network. I didn't care what they thought they knew. Sienna's thank you speech came during dessert service, after the cake cutting and bouquet toss, when guests were relaxed and receptive to sincere sentiment rather than performative gratitude. She stood with Marcus beside her, holding his hand visibly, and thanked everyone for attending before shifting specifically to acknowledge me by name. She said that planning this wedding had taught her uncomfortable lessons about the difference between aesthetic perfection and authentic celebration, that she'd initially focused so intensely on creating an Instagram-worthy event that she'd lost sight of honoring the actual people who made the marriage possible. She said that my willingness to enforce boundaries, even when it threatened to derail everything, had been an act of courage and integrity that she hoped to emulate in her own parenting someday, teaching future children that love included accountability and respect required more than financial transactions. She said she was grateful to have me, not just as Marcus's mother, but as someone she hoped to build genuine relationship with going forward. The applause that followed felt generous, sympathetic to both parties. The evening wound down gradually as older guests departed, and the younger crowd took over the dance floor for increasingly energetic music that made my bones feel ancient in comparison. I found myself at the bar around 10:30, ordering decaf coffee and people watching the celebration I'd nearly canceled into oblivion, feeling complex emotions I couldn't entirely name. Rita had texted earlier, asking how everything was going, and I responded with a photo of myself at the head table beside Marcus, proof that the crisis had resolved in at least the superficial ways that photographs could capture. She replied immediately saying she was proud of me for standing firm and for recognizing genuine contrition when it appeared, that wisdom meant knowing when to fight and when to accept offered peace. I sipped my terrible venue coffee and contemplated whether I'd actually achieved wisdom or just reached exhaustion, whether Sienna's transformation would last beyond the honeymoon period or fade as soon as daily life resumed. Only time would reveal which narrative we were living. The venue coordinator Denise found me near midnight as the party was breaking up, vendors packing equipment and guests collecting favors and saying prolonged goodbyes. She said she wanted to thank me personally for handling the situation with grace and clarity, that in 20 years of wedding coordination she'd seen countless family conflicts, but rarely saw them resolve in ways that strengthened relationships rather than fracturing them permanently. She said most people either capitulated to avoid confrontation or scorched the earth entirely, unable to find the narrow path between enabling and destroying. I told her honestly that I still didn't know whether I'd found that path or just gotten lucky that Marcus and Sienna were capable of reflection under pressure. Denise smiled and said that luck was what happened when someone refused to accept less than they deserved, and other people chose to rise to meet that standard. She handed me a small wrapped box, saying it was customary for the venue to provide a gift to the primary financial sponsor, usually the parents who'd funded the celebration. I opened it to find a crystal picture frame engraved with the date and Marcus and Sienna's names. I drove home around 1 a.m. with the picture frame on my passenger seat and my navy dress slightly rumpled from hours of sitting and dancing and navigating the emotional complexity of watching my son marry someone I still didn't entirely trust but was willing to give honest chance. The house was dark and quiet when I arrived, no messages waiting on my machine, everyone apparently satisfied that the crisis had passed and normal life could resume. I made actual good coffee, the kind I kept for special occasions, and sat at my kitchen table surrounded by photos of Marcus's childhood while processing the 48-hour emotional marathon I'd just survived. The refrigerator photo of 8-year-old Marcus holding his science fair ribbon caught my eye, and I thought about how many times I'd prioritized his needs above my own, how many doubles shifts and missed events and deferred dreams had accumulated into the life he'd been able to build. I didn't regret those choices, but I recognized now that I'd taught him through them that my presence could be assumed rather than honored. That pattern had to change. Sunday morning arrived with texts from Marcus and Sienna thanking me again for making the wedding possible and for giving them the chance to prove they understood what they'd done wrong. Sienna had sent a photo from the reception showing the three of us together at the head table, Marcus in the middle with arms around both his bride and his mother, everyone genuinely smiling rather than performing happiness for cameras. She captioned it, "The family I want to build," with a heart emoji, and I allowed myself to believe she might actually mean it, even while maintaining healthy skepticism about whether crisis-driven revelations would survive the test of mundane daily life. I texted back something simple about looking forward to building that family together. No pressure or expectations spelled out, just acknowledgement of shared intention. Then I forwarded the photo to Rita with a note saying that maybe enforcing boundaries really could teach better behavior if people were willing to learn. Rita replied with a string of celebration emojis that made me laugh despite my exhaustion. The hardest part was over, though the actual work of building new patterns was just beginning. Monday brought a return to normal hospital routines, vital signs and medication rounds, and the comfortable anonymity of being one nurse among many, rather than the mother who'd nearly canceled her son's wedding. But word had spread somehow among my co-workers, probably through Rita, who couldn't keep secrets to save her life despite excellent clinical judgment. And several nurses approached me during breaks to say they'd heard what happened and admired my courage in standing firm. A few shared their own stories of family boundary enforcement, adult children who'd learned to take parental support for granted until consequences materialized, relationships damaged and sometimes destroyed by enabling patterns that masqueraded as love. The common thread in all their stories was regret over not acting sooner, not enforcing boundaries before resentment calcified into permanent estrangement. I'd acted just in time, it seemed, catching the pattern early enough that Marcus and Sienna could still choose differently. Whether they would sustain that choice remained the open question that only time would answer through accumulated evidence of consistent behavior change. The week passed in strange, suspended normalcy, my life resuming its usual contours while I waited to see whether the wedding weekend transformation would prove durable or evaporate under the pressure of ordinary life. Marcus and Sienna had left Sunday afternoon for a honeymoon in Costa Rica. 2 weeks of beaches and rainforests that I'd partially funded as a wedding gift back before the seating chart crisis, when I was still operating under the assumption that financial generosity would translate naturally into familial respect. They'd sent a few photos of sunsets and wildlife, maintaining contact without overwhelming me with constant updates, seemingly finding appropriate balance between independence and connection. I appreciated the effort even while recognizing it might be conscious performance in these early weeks when they were still motivated by recent crisis and consequent promises. The real test would come months from now when the memory of almost losing everything had faded and old patterns beckoned with comfortable familiarity. I would remain vigilant without broadcasting my skepticism, giving them space to prove themselves while protecting my own boundaries. 2 weeks after the wedding, Marcus and Sienna returned from honeymoon and invited me to dinner at their apartment, a first attempt at implementing their promise of monthly family gatherings and inclusive decision-making. I arrived with wine and low expectations, prepared for awkward conversation and performative warmth masking continued tension. Instead, I found Sienna cooking actual food rather than ordering catering, Marcus setting the table with mismatched plates from their combined household merger, both of them treating my presence as genuinely wanted rather than socially obligatory. We ate pasta and salad while discussing their honeymoon with actual back-and-forth conversation rather than parallel monologues. And when Sienna mentioned they were considering buying a house in the next year, she immediately turned to me and asked my opinion on neighborhoods and mortgage strategies. It was a small thing, asking my input, but it represented the kind of inclusion I'd been denied during wedding planning. I offered thoughts without taking over the conversation, modeling the advisory role I hoped to occupy rather than the controlling presence or ignored checkbook I refused to become. After dinner, Sienna asked if we could talk privately while Marcus did the dishes, a request that sent brief panic through my chest before I remembered that healthy relationships required direct communication between all parties rather than routing everything through Marcus as interpreter and buffer. We sat on their small balcony overlooking the parking lot, not picturesque but private, and Sienna said she'd been thinking a lot during the honeymoon about patterns and choices and the kind of family she wanted to create. She said her therapist, someone she'd apparently started seeing right after the wedding crisis, had helped her recognize that her childhood experiences of being treated as inconvenient had taught her to view family relationships as transactional and hierarchical rather than mutually supportive. She was working to unlearn those patterns, but the work was harder than she'd expected because the old habits had decades of reinforcement behind them. She asked if I'd be willing to tell her directly when I saw her slipping into controlling or dismissive behavior rather than just accumulating resentment silently. I agreed immediately. I told Sienna that my biggest fear wasn't occasional backsliding into old patterns, but rather that she and Marcus would perform changed behavior for a few months until they felt confident I'd let my guard down, then gradually revert to treating me as an ATM who occasionally warranted polite acknowledgement. Sienna looked uncomfortable, but didn't get defensive, instead asking what specific behaviors would signal to me that reversion was happening versus normal boundary negotiation between in-laws finding their rhythm. I appreciated that she understood the difference between hostile skepticism and reasonable caution based on prior experience. We spent an hour on that balcony outlining expectations and concerns with surprising candor, establishing the kind of honest communication foundation that should have existed before wedding planning ever began. By the time Marcus joined us with coffee, Sienna and I had drafted a rough agreement about monthly dinners, advance consultation on major decisions affecting me, and mutual permission to address problems directly rather than through Marcus. It felt simultaneously too formal and absolutely necessary given where we'd started. The months following established a rhythm that wasn't perfect but was honestly better than I'd expected. Monthly dinners rotating between their apartment and my house, occasional lunch dates with just Sienna when she wanted advice about work situations or household decisions, regular calls with Marcus that felt like actual conversation rather than obligatory check-ins. They consulted me before accepting job offers that would have moved them 3 states away, discussing the decision collaboratively rather than announcing it as fait accompli. When they found out Sienna was pregnant in December, 5 months after the wedding, they told me in person rather than through a text announcement or social media post, sharing the news with genuine excitement about me becoming a grandmother rather than informing me as afterthought. I cried happy tears for the first time in years, holding my son and his wife in my living room while processing the reality that my boundary enforcement had actually worked, that demanding respect had improved rather than destroyed our relationship. The baby was due in August, and already they were talking about me being present for the birth if I wanted, asking my preferences rather than making assumptions. The nursery planning became an unexpected test of our new patterns when Sienna's mother tried to insert herself as primary grandmother, arriving uninvited from Arizona and immediately beginning to redecorate the baby's room according to her own aesthetic preferences without consulting Marcus or Sienna. I watched from the sidelines as Sienna employed the same boundary-setting techniques I'd modeled during the wedding crisis, firmly but politely informing her mother that decisions about the nursery would be made by the parents with input from invited advisors, and that uninvited redecorating constituted overstepping regardless of good intentions behind it. Sienna's mother reacted with wounded indignation remarkably similar to how Marcus had initially responded to my wedding intervention. And I saw Sienna struggle with the guilt of enforcing boundaries against someone who claimed to be helping. I offered support, without taking over. Sharing my own experience of learning that true help respected the recipient's autonomy rather than imposing the helper's vision. Sienna's mother eventually left in a huff, but not before Sienna stood firm on her boundaries with impressive consistency. I was genuinely proud of her growth. The baby arrived in August as predicted, a healthy girl they named Sophie Eleanor, the middle name chosen deliberately to honor me in a way that felt genuinely meaningful rather than perfunctory. I was present for the birth as invited, holding Sienna's hand through contractions while Marcus handled the other side, all three of us working together to welcome new life into the complicated family we'd built through crisis and conscious effort. Sophie's arrival shifted something fundamental in our dynamic, giving us shared purpose beyond managing our own interpersonal tensions, focusing our energy on building the healthy family patterns we wanted her to inherit. I held my granddaughter in the hospital room while Marcus and Sienna slept off their exhaustion, studying her tiny features and promising silently that she'd grow up knowing her grandmother as present and valued, not hidden away or treated as inconvenient. The wedding crisis that had nearly destroyed us had ultimately created space for this moment, this connection, this family that chose health over convenience. It had been worth the risk. Now, 18 months after the wedding I'd almost canceled, I sit in my kitchen with Sophie asleep in her portable crib nearby while Marcus and Sienna handle errands, trusting me to care for their daughter without hovering or micromanaging. The refrigerator photos have expanded to include wedding pictures, Sophie's birth announcement, family dinners around my table with everyone genuinely smiling. The crystal picture frame Denise gave me holds my favorite photo from the wedding, the candid shot of Sienna mouthing "thank you" while I nodded acknowledgement, capturing the moment we chose to build something real instead of maintaining pretty lies. I've learned that enforcing boundaries isn't cruelty, but rather the foundation of sustainable relationships. That people who genuinely love you will rise to meet reasonable standards rather than demanding you accept less than you deserve. Marcus and Sienna still aren't perfect. Nobody is. But they've demonstrated consistent effort to honor their promises, and effort sustained over time becomes character. I'm grateful I stood firm. Grateful I risked everything to demand basic respect. Grateful that the story I'm living now is one of repair and growth, rather than enabling and resentment. The wedding happened, and so did everything that mattered more.